Look at this locomotive for a moment and try to work out what's wrong with it. It takes most people a second or two, and then it hits you. The cab, the little cabin where the driver is supposed to sit, isn't at the back where it belongs. It's stuck in the middle of the engine, perched on top of the boiler, straddling it like a saddle on a steel horse, and the man who shovels the coal isn't with the driver at all. He's standing alone at the very back, out in the open, no roof, no walls, exposed to the wind and the rain and whatever else the railway decides to throw at him. This was not a mistake. It was not a one-off, some strange prototype that never left the workshop. The American railroads built thousands of these machines, ran them for decades, and for a while they were the backbone of an entire region's railways. And then, after years of dead and broken men, the United States government did something it almost never does to a simple piece of machinery. It banned it. Not the company that made it, not one bad batch. The design itself declared too dangerous to keep building ever again. This is the story of the Camelback locomotive, a machine that was, on paper, a stroke of genius. A clever, money-saving, beautifully logical solution to a real engineering problem. And it was also quietly and steadily killing the very men who ran it. So let's find out how a design this lethal got built 3,000 times before anyone stopped it. Because the reason it existed in the first place is just as strange as the reason it had to die. There is a hard lesson hiding inside this whole story, and it's worth holding on to. There is a difference, an enormous and sometimes fatal difference, between a machine that works and a machine that's safe. The Camelback worked. It worked brilliantly, at the one job it was designed for. The trouble was everything else, and by the time the railroads admitted that, the body count was already written into the design. To understand why anyone would build a locomotive this strange, you have to go back to the coal. In the late 1800s, the railroads of the eastern United States, especially in Pennsylvania, sat right on top of one of the most valuable fuels in the country, anthracite, hard coal. It burned hot, clean, and slow, and it was prized for heating homes across America. But mining it left behind enormous quantities of a near-worthless byproduct, a fine, dusty waste called culm. Small, broken bits of anthracite that nobody wanted to buy, piling up around the mines and mountains of the stuff. And to a railroad, a mountain of fuel that nobody wants is a mountain of money sitting on the ground. The only problem was getting a locomotive to actually burn it. That was harder than it sounds. Culm burns reluctantly in a thin, spread out layer, and to get enough heat out of it, you needed a firebox of monstrous size, a grate far wider than anything on a normal engine. And in 1877, a master mechanic on the Reading Railroad named John Wootten built exactly that, the Wootten firebox. A vast, wide grate that could spread the cheap culm thin and burn it efficiently, turning the railroad's own waste into nearly free fuel. The savings were real and immediate, something like $2,000 a year per engine, which in the money of the day was a small fortune. On the numbers alone, Wootten had solved the problem completely, but the Wootten firebox created a brand new problem, and this is where the trouble starts. The firebox was so enormously wide that it simply would not fit between or behind the rear wheels the way a normal firebox did. It had to sit up high, above the wheels, and it was so big and so tall that it blocked everything behind it, including the one thing a locomotive cannot do without, the cab. There was simply no room left at the back of the engine for the crew to sit and see where they were going. The solution they landed on is the thing that makes you tilt your head when you first see one. If the cab couldn't go behind the giant firebox, then it would go in front of it. They picked the driver's cab up and bolted it down right in the middle of the locomotive, straddling the boiler, halfway along the engine's back, and, as a strange little footnote, the very first true Camelback wasn't even born in America. One of these wide firebox engines was shipped to Europe in 1879 to show off, and it turned out to be too tall to fit under the bridges and through the tunnels there. So in a French rail yard, the engine's own driver had the cab cut off the top and remounted forward of the firebox, just to make it fit. The fix worked. And that improvised solution became the template for thousands of machines to come. Now, on a diagram, splitting the locomotive like this almost looks reasonable. The driver gets a clear view forward from his perch in the middle, the huge firebox gets all the room it needs at the back, everybody's happy. But a locomotive is not a diagram. It is a violent, vibrating, 100-ton machine, and the moment you put real men inside this arrangement and send it down a real railway, the cracks start to show. There were 4 of them, and the 4th one was lethal. The first problem was simple, and you've probably already spotted it. The driver and the fireman were now completely separated, with the entire length of a roaring boiler standing between them. On a normal engine, the 2 men work side by side, shouting to each other, reading each other, coordinating by instinct. On a Camelback, they couldn't see each other at all. To communicate, they were reduced to yanking on signal cords and flashing lights back and forth past the boiler, a clumsy code for what should have been a conversation. And on a railway, the moments when a crew most needs to act as one, a sudden hazard, a signal, an emergency stop, are exactly the moments when there's no time to play guessing games through a wall of steel. The second problem belonged entirely to the fireman, and it was grim. While the driver at least had a cab, a roof over his head, and walls around him, the fireman was left at the very back of the engine, on an open deck, shoveling coal into that enormous firebox, with almost nothing to protect him. In the gentle weather of summer, an inconvenience. In a Pennsylvania winter, riding into driving snow and freezing rain at speed hour after hour, it was something closer to a punishment, and it was more than just uncomfortable. If the engine lurched or jolted over rough track, or worst of all, derailed, the fireman was standing on an exposed platform with very little to hold on to and nothing around him to break a fall. His job came with a kind of constant low-level peril that no crewman should have had to accept just to keep a train moving. But the first 2 problems, as bad as they were problems of discomfort and difficulty. The third problem was a problem of speed and corrosion and bad luck, and on its own it would have been serious. And then there's the 4th. So stay with me, because this is the one that earned the Camelback its darkest nickname, and the one that finally turned public opinion against the entire design. Before we get to it, the third problem: visibility and isolation. The driver, sitting up in his little box in the middle of the engine, could see the track ahead well enough, but he was cut off from his own train, blind to much of what was happening behind him, marooned on top of the machine he was supposed to be in full command of. He was the captain of the ship, sitting alone in a glass box bolted to the mast, unable to talk to his own crew. In an emergency, that isolation cost precious seconds. And on the railways of the era, seconds were the difference between a close call and a catastrophe. And now the 4th problem, the one that mattered most. To understand it, you need to know exactly where the driver was sitting. His cab, remember, straddled the boiler in the middle of the locomotive, which meant he was perched directly above the driving wheels and directly above the long steel connecting rods, the side rods, that linked those wheels together and hammered back and forth as the engine ran. These rods are heavy, they move with tremendous force, and they take a brutal beating, flexing and pounding thousands of times a mile. And every so often, under all that stress, one of them would fail. A side rod would crack or snap clean through while the engine was running at speed. On a normal locomotive, a broken rod is a serious, dangerous failure. The flailing steel can do real damage, but the crew sits at the back, away from the worst of it. On a Camelback, the driver was sitting right on top of it. When a side rod let go at speed, it could whip upward with savage force and tear straight up through the floor of the center cab into the small space where the driver had nowhere to go. The men who ran these engines understood this perfectly, and they gave the Camelbacks a name that said everything. On the Baltimore and Ohio, the crews called them snappers, because of the way a side rod could snap and lash up into the cab and turn a routine run into a fatal one. This was not a theoretical danger debated by engineers in an office. It was a real, recurring horror, and over the years, it killed men in accidents that the railroads could not explain away. So now we arrive at the question the whole story has been building toward. If this design was so dangerous, why on earth did they build 3,000 of them? And the uncomfortable answer is the same answer you'll find behind a lot of dangerous machines in history. because it made money and because the dangers fell on the men, not on the balance sheet. The Camelback burned nearly free fuel. It saved a fortune. The crews who paid the price for those savings had little power to change anything. And so the engines kept rolling off the production lines, year after year, decade after decade, while the list of dead and injured quietly grew. But it could not last forever. As the years went on, the railroad workers' unions pushed harder and harder against the design, refusing to accept that a man should risk a side rod through the floor or a winter spent freezing on an open deck simply because hard coal was cheap. The accidents accumulated, the public mood turned, and eventually the federal government stepped in the form of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the body with the power to regulate the railroads. The commission did not ban the Camelback in a single dramatic stroke. It strangled it slowly. Around 1918, it moved to stop the construction of new Camelbacks, with only a few exceptions allowed to slip through in the years that followed. And by 1927, the door was finally shut for good. No new Camelbacks. Ever. The design itself had been declared too dangerous to build. If you find these stories fascinating, the brilliant ideas that turned out to be quietly lethal, the machines that were too clever for their own good, then leave a comment and subscribe, because the history of the railways is full of them, and some are far stranger and darker than a locomotive with its cab in the wrong place. And here is the quiet final twist, the part that makes the whole thing feel almost inevitable. By the time the ban came down, technology had already begun making the Camelback pointless anyway. A new invention, the mechanical stoker, could feed coal into the firebox automatically, which changed the whole layout of the engine and lifted the crew up to a safer position where a broken rod was no longer a death sentence. The very problem the Camelback had been built to solve, burning cheap, awkward fuel, could now be handled by ordinary, safer locomotives. The Camelback wasn't just dangerous, it had become unnecessary. The ban simply finished off a design that the future had already left behind. The ones that already existed were allowed to keep running, grandfathered in, and a few rattled along into the 1950s before the last of them was finally retired. And today, out of the thousands that were built, only a tiny handful survive. The most famous of them, Central Railroad of New Jersey, number 592, sits in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum, while another, B&O number 173, rests in a museum in St. Louis. Cold, silent, and still, you can walk right up to them now and look at that strange cab, marooned in the middle of the boiler, perfectly safe, going nowhere. It's hard to stand in front of one and imagine the noise, the vibration, and the very real fear of the men who once climbed up into that little box and hoped the rods would hold for one more run. Because in the end, the Camelback is a monument to that line we started with, the gap between a machine that works and a machine that's safe. The engineers had solved their problem with real brilliance. They had taken a worthless pile of waste and turned it into nearly free power, and on paper, it was a triumph. They had simply forgotten to ask whether the men inside the machine would survive it. And it took dead drivers, frozen firemen, and decades of union fury before anyone with the power to act finally decided that no amount of cheap coal was worth a side rod through the floor. And yet, the Camelback was far from the only machine the railroads built and lived to regret. Because if a locomotive could be banned for the way it killed its own crew, imagine the designs that were so unstable, so reckless, or so far ahead of their time that they tore themselves apart, or were buried before the public ever found out how dangerous they really were. There is a whole graveyard of machines that the railways quietly decided the world was better off without. And the next one we're going to dig up was even harder to kill. That's where we're going next.